Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I played Among Us on the dark web. I think I play with real human characters. Alright, so this is going to sound insane, but hear me out. I need to get this off my chest because it's been eating me alive, and I don't know who else to turn to. It all started a couple of months ago. I was deep into gaming, and Among Us had become my latest obsession. I loved the strategy, the deception, the thrill of being the imposter. It was fun, but it got repetitive after a while. One night, I was browsing some forums looking for mods or hacks to spice things up a bit. That's when I stumbled across a post about a dark web version of Among Us. The post was vague but enticing, promising a more realistic and immersive experience. Being the curious idiot I am, I decided to check it out. I should have known better. I used Tor to navigate to the dark web link provided in the post. The site was minimalistic, just a black background with a red enter button in the middle. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. After a few seconds, a chat box popped up, asking for my username and email. I gave them my usual gaming handle and a throwaway email I used for spam. A few minutes later, I received a link to download the game and an invitation to join a Discord server. The game file was surprisingly small, and the installation was quick. The graphics were similar to the original Among Us, but everything felt darker, more sinister. The characters moved more fluidly, and the maps had an eerie, almost too real quality to them. I joined the Discord server, and it was filled with other players talking about their experiences. They all seemed excited, which made me feel better about my decision. The first game I joined was pretty standard, 10 players, 3 imposters, but there was something off about the other players. Their usernames were weird, just random strings of numbers and letters. I brushed it off, thinking they were just trying to be edgy or anonymous. As the game progressed, I noticed the tasks were different. Instead of the usual light-hearted chores, these tasks were dark and twisted. One of them involved cleaning a room that looked like a torture chamber, complete with bloodstains and rusty tools. Another task was disposing of evidence, which involved dragging what looked like a human body into a furnace. My heart raced, but I told myself it was just a game, just some sick, twisted game. I kept playing, trying to complete my tasks and avoid the imposters. But then, things took a turn for the worse. During one of the rounds, I got killed by an imposter. Instead of the usual animation, the screen went black, and I was shown a live feed of a dark, dingy room. In the center of the room was a man tied to a chair, struggling and screaming. His screams were muffled, like he had something in his mouth. I could see the fear in his eyes, and it sent chills down my spine. The feed cut out after a few seconds, and I was back in the game lobby. My hands were shaking, and I felt sick to my stomach. I wanted to quit, but something kept me going. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or just plain stupidity, but I decided to keep playing. The next game was even worse. This time, I was an imposter. My fellow imposters and I had to take care of the crewmates. The tasks were grotesque, involving real-life torture methods. One of the tasks was to electrocute a player, and the detail was horrifyingly realistic. I could see the character convulsing, smoke rising from their body. After completing the task, I received another live feed. This time, it showed a woman in a similar dark room, tied to a table. She was crying, her face bruised and bloody. A figure in a mask entered the frame, holding a knife. He started cutting her, and she screamed in agony. I could hear her bones breaking, her flesh tearing. The sound was so real, so visceral. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I forced myself to finish the game, hoping it would be the last. When it ended, I closed the game and shut down my computer. I sat there in the dark, my mind racing. What had I just witnessed? Was it real or just a sick prank? I decided to investigate. I went back to the Discord server and started asking questions. The other players were cryptic, talking in circles and using coded language. But one of them, a user named Watcher, sent me a private message. Enjoying the game? They asked. What the hell is this? I replied, my fingers trembling. It's a more immersive experience, Watcher said. Real stakes, real consequences. Are those people real? I asked, dreading the answer. Wouldn't you like to know? Watcher replied, adding a winking emoji. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was too much. I needed to get out. I left the Discord server, uninstalled the game, and deleted all traces of it from my computer. But the images and sounds haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the terrified faces, heard the blood-curdling screams. I thought that was the end of it, but things got worse. A few days later, I started receiving emails from unknown senders. They were filled with pictures and videos of the live feeds I had seen in the game. They included new footage too. Footage of me sitting at my computer, playing the game, my face lit up by the screen. I felt like I was being watched, followed. I stopped leaving my house, barely slept. Every time I heard a noise, I jumped. My paranoia was consuming me. Then one night, I heard footsteps outside my apartment. I looked through the peephole, but saw nothing. I checked the windows, but they were all locked. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Then there was a knock on my door. A slow, deliberate knock. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't answer. The knocking continued, relentless. I felt like I was going to lose my mind. Finally, it stopped. I waited for what felt like hours before opening the door. There was no one there, but on the floor was a USB drive. I took it inside, my hands shaking. Against my better judgment, I plugged it into my computer. There was only one file on it. Play Me, MP4. I opened it and my blood ran cold. The video showed me, sleeping in my bed. The camera moved closer, focusing on my face. I could hear my own breathing, see the rise and fall of my chest. The camera stayed there for a few minutes before the screen went black. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm trapped in a nightmare, and I can't wake up. If anyone has any advice, please, I need help. I don't know how much more of this I can take. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, it all made me jump out of my skin. I felt watched, hunted. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. The next morning, I decided I needed to take action. I called the police and told them everything. They didn't take me seriously at first. Just another paranoid gamer, they thought. But when I showed them the emails and the USB drive, they agreed to send a patrol car to keep an eye on my place. I felt a bit safer with the police nearby, but it didn't last. That night, I heard footsteps again. This time, they were inside my apartment building, right outside my door. The knocking started, soft at first, then growing louder and more insistent. I could hear the voice of one of the officers outside telling someone to stop. There was a brief scuffle, then silence. I cautiously opened the door to see the officer standing there, a bewildered look on his face. He told me there was no one outside when he checked, but he had heard the footsteps too. He promised to stay on watch for the rest of the night, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. The next day, I received another email. This one had no text, just a single image. It was a screenshot of my Among Us character, standing in the middle of one of those dark, twisted rooms. But this time, the character wasn't alone. Standing next to it was a figure dressed in black, wearing a mask. The same mask I had seen in the live feeds. My blood ran cold. Was this some kind of sick joke? Or was it a threat? I decided to dig deeper into the dark web, trying to find out more about the game and its creators. I found forums and chat rooms filled with people talking about similar experiences. Some claimed it was all an elaborate ARG, alternate reality game, while others insisted it was real, that the people in the videos were real victims. One user, going by the name Deep Diver, reached out to me privately. They claimed to have been part of the development team for the game, but had left when things got too dark. According to them, the game was designed by a group of sadistic individuals who thrived on the fear and pain of others. They would kidnap people, force them into these gruesome scenarios, and then use the footage for their twisted game. I asked Deep Diver if there was any way to stop them, to expose them. They told me there was, but it would be dangerous. They sent me a series of files and instructions on how to infiltrate the game's servers and gather evidence. It sounded like a suicide mission, but I was desperate. I needed to put an end to this nightmare. I spent the next few days preparing, following Deep Diver's instructions to the letter. I set up a secure connection, downloaded the necessary software, and steeled myself for what I might find. When I was ready, I logged into the game one last time. The familiar eerie atmosphere greeted me, but this time I knew what to look for. I navigated through the dark rooms, avoiding the tasks and focusing on finding the hidden files Deep Diver had mentioned. It wasn't long before I found a folder labeled Projects. Inside were hundreds of video files, each named after a different date and time. I opened one at random and immediately regretted it. The video showed a man tied to a chair, just like in the live feeds. He was screaming, begging for his life as the masked figure approached him with a knife. I quickly closed the video and moved on, trying to keep my composure. I copied as many files as I could onto an external drive, hoping it would be enough to convince the authorities. As I was about to log off, a message popped up on the screen. Leaving so soon? It was Watcher. My heart pounded in my chest as I typed back, "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" "Consider it a game," Watcher replied. "A game with real stakes. And you're losing." Before I could respond, my screen went black. Panic set in as I tried to reboot my computer, but nothing worked. Then I heard it again, the footsteps, this time inside my apartment. I grabbed the external drive and ran to the door, but it was too late. The masked figure was standing there, blocking my exit. I froze, my mind racing. There was no way out. The figure stepped closer, and I could see the glint of a knife in their hand. Desperation took over, and I lunged at them, hoping to knock the knife away. We struggled, the knife slicing into my arm. Pain shot through me, but I didn't stop. I managed to push the figure back and make a break for the window. I threw it open and climbed out onto the fire escape, my heart pounding in my ears. I could hear the figure inside, moving towards the window. I climbed down as fast as I could, the metal steps cold and slippery under my feet. I reached the ground and took off running, not looking back. I made it to a nearby police station, collapsing in front of the desk officer. Between gasps for breath, I told them everything, showing them the external drive. They took me seriously this time, launching an investigation into the game and the people behind it. I'm in a safe house now, under police protection. They say they're close to shutting down the operation, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. The images, the sounds, they haunt me. I can't escape them. And I know, deep down, that as long as the game exists, there will always be someone watching, waiting for their next victim. Living in the safe house provided a brief sense of security, but it was a fragile illusion. The days blurred together in a haze of fear and paranoia. I rarely left the room, and when I did, it was always under the watchful eyes of police officers. They assured me that they were closing in on the people responsible, but progress was slow. Too slow. One evening, as I was trying to distract myself with mindless TV shows, there was a knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. It was too late for a casual visit. I cautiously approached the door and asked who it was. "It's Officer Daniels," came the reply. "I need to update you on the investigation." I recognized the voice and unlocked the door. Officer Daniels was one of the few who had believed me from the start. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, but something was off. His usually calm demeanor was replaced with tension. "What's wrong?" I asked, my anxiety spiking. "We've hit a snag," he said, avoiding my eyes. "The people behind this, they're more powerful than we thought. They have connections, resources. It's like trying to catch shadows." A cold dread settled in my stomach. What does that mean for me? It means you need to stay vigilant. They know we're onto them, and they might escalate. As he spoke, a loud crash came from the back of the house. We both jumped, and Daniels drew his gun. "Stay here," he ordered, moving towards the noise. I didn't argue. I retreated to the corner of the room, clutching a chair leg like a makeshift weapon. Minutes passed, in tense silence. Then a blood-curdling scream echoed through the house. I recognized Daniel's voice. Without thinking, I bolted from the room and ran towards the sound. The back door was ajar, swinging in the wind. Outside, in the dim light of the alley, I saw Daniels lying on the ground, blood pooling around him. I rushed to his side, my hands shaking as I tried to assess his injuries. His eyes fluttered open, and he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Run," he gasped. "They're here." Panic surged through me. I looked around, but the alley was empty. No masked figures, no shadows, just the oppressive darkness closing in. I had no choice. I had to run. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and took off down the alley. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they would give out. I found myself in an unfamiliar part of the city, the streets empty and silent. I ducked into a small park, hiding behind a cluster of trees. I tried to catch my breath, my mind racing. Daniels was probably dead. The police were compromised. I was alone. As I sat there, trying to come up with a plan, I heard footsteps approaching. I held my breath, praying they would pass by, but they didn't. The footsteps stopped right in front of the trees. I peeked out and saw a pair of black boots, scuffed and dirty. come out, wherever you are," a voice called. It was the same voice from the game, the same voice that had taunted me in the chat. Watcher. My heart pounded in my chest. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. I was trapped. The only thing I could do was try to outsmart him. I stayed perfectly still, hoping he would move on, but Watcher wasn't fooled. "I know you're there," he said, a cruel smile in his voice. "You can't hide from me." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. Think. I needed a distraction, something to buy me time. I reached into my pocket and found my phone. It was almost dead, but it might be enough. I turned the volume up, set an alarm, and tossed it away from me. The alarm blared, and Watcher turned towards the sound. I took my chance. I sprang from my hiding spot and ran in the opposite direction. I didn't look back, didn't stop. I just ran. I could hear Watcher cursing behind me, his footsteps pounding the pavement. I burst out of the park and onto a busy street. Cars honked, people shouted, but I didn't stop. I darted into a convenience store, the bright lights blinding me for a moment. I ran to the back and hid behind a shelf, my chest heaving. The door chimed as someone entered. I peeked through a gap in the shelves and saw Watcher. He was scanning the aisles, his eyes cold and calculating. I ducked down, trying to make myself as small as possible. "Can I help you?" the cashier asked, oblivious to the danger. "Just looking for a friend," Watcher replied smoothly. "They ran in here, but I guess they must have left." The cashier nodded and went back to his magazine. Watcher lingered for a moment, then turned and left. I waited, counting to 100 before I dared to move. When I was sure he was gone, I approached the cashier. "Call the police," I whispered urgently. "I'm in danger." The cashier's eyes widened, but he nodded and picked up the phone. I stayed in the store, my nerves frayed, until the police arrived. This time, they took me to a different safe house, one that was supposedly more secure. But as I lay in bed that night, I knew it was only a matter of time. Watcher was still out there, and he wouldn't stop until he found me. The game was far from over, and I was still a pawn in their sick, twisted game. The new safe house felt like a prison. The windows were barred, and a heavy-duty lock secured the door. I was under constant surveillance, with officers stationed outside my room 24/7. Despite these precautions, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was all futile. Watcher had found me once. He could find me again. Days turned into weeks, each one more agonizing than the last. I barely slept, jumping at every noise. The police assured me they were closing in on the culprits, but I had heard it all before. My only solace came from Deep Diver, who continued to send me updates and information. They were working tirelessly to uncover the identities of those behind the game. One night, as I was lying in bed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Deep Diver. "I found something. It's big. We need to talk." My heart pounded as I replied, "What did you find?" "Meet me at the old warehouse on 5th, midnight. Come alone." A chill ran down my spine. This had to be a trap. But what choice did I have? I needed answers, and Deep Diver was my only lead. I waited until the guards changed shifts, then slipped out of the safe house. The streets were eerily quiet as I made my way to the warehouse. When I arrived, the place was dark and abandoned. I crept inside, my nerves on edge. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps. I called out softly, "Deep Diver?" A figure emerged from the shadows. It was a young woman, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. "You're here," she said, her voice trembling. "We don't have much time." "Who are you?" I asked, my eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. "Call me Sarah," she replied. "I've been investigating this for months. These people, they're monsters." "What did you find?" I pressed, trying to keep my fear in check. She handed me a folder stuffed with documents and photographs. "This is everything. Names, locations, even some of their financial records. They operate like a cartel, using the dark web to hide their tracks. But I've linked them to several missing persons cases. Real people are being abducted and used in their sick games." As I flipped through the folder, the horror of what I was seeing sank in. There were pictures of people I recognized from the game, their faces twisted in agony, detailed records of their abductions, and gruesome notes on their fates. "We need to go to the police," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not that simple," Sarah replied. "They're everywhere. Corruption runs deep. We can't trust anyone." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Sarah's eyes widened in terror. "They're here," she whispered. "We need to hide." We ducked behind a stack of crates, holding our breath. The footsteps grew louder, and I could hear muffled voices. They were searching for us. I clutched the folder tightly, knowing it was our only chance at exposing the truth. Suddenly, a harsh light flooded our hiding spot. I squinted against the brightness, my heart pounding in my chest. A figure stepped forward, and I recognized the mask immediately. Watcher. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "Look what we have here, the little rats trying to spoil our fun." Sarah stood up, defiance in her eyes. "It's over, Watcher. We have enough evidence to bring you down." Watcher laughed, a cold, cruel sound. "You really think it's that easy? You have no idea what you're dealing with." He raised a gun, pointing it directly at Sarah. "Say goodbye," he sneered. Before he could pull the trigger, I lunged at him, knocking the gun from his hand. We struggled, but he was stronger. He threw me to the ground, pinning me down with a knee on my chest. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," Watcher said, pressing harder. I gasped for breath, my vision blurring. Just as I thought it was over, there was a loud bang. Watcher staggered back, blood blooming on his shirt. Sarah stood there, holding his gun, her hands shaking. "Run!" she screamed, pulling me to my feet. We bolted from the warehouse, the sounds of chaos behind us. I didn't look back. We ran through the dark streets, our breaths ragged, until we reached a police station. This time, they listened. With the evidence Sarah had gathered, they launched a full-scale investigation. The operation was massive, spanning multiple cities and involving numerous agencies. The media caught wind of it, and soon the world knew about the horrors hidden in the dark web game. Arrests were made, and the victims' families were given some semblance of closure. But for me, the nightmare wasn't over. I moved to a new city, changed my name, tried to start over, but the memories haunted me. Every shadow, every unfamiliar face sent me spiraling into panic. The scars on my arm from that night were a constant reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. Sarah and I kept in touch, supporting each other as best we could. We knew that even though the main players had been caught, the network was vast. There were others out there, waiting to pick up where Watcher had left off. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of this. The fear, the paranoia, it's all consuming. But I have to keep going. For the victims, for those still out there. I have to believe that someday the nightmare will end. Until then, I remained vigilant, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next game to begin. I thought moving to a new city and changing my identity would bring peace, but I underestimated the reach of the darkness that had ensnared me. Months passed in a blur of therapy sessions and medication, but the nightmares never ceased. Each night I saw Watcher's masked face, his cold eyes, and heard the screams of the victims. It felt like the walls were closing in on me, and I couldn't escape. Sarah and I had become close, bonded by our shared trauma. We leaned on each other for support, trying to rebuild our lives. But one evening, she called me, her voice trembling. "They found me," she whispered, fear lacing every word. My blood ran cold. "What do you mean? How?" "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. "But I got an email. It's him, Watcher. He's not dead." I could barely breathe. "Where are you? Are you safe?" "I'm at my apartment. I've locked all the doors, but I'm scared." "Stay put," I said, grabbing my keys. "I'm coming over." I raced to her apartment, my mind racing with possibilities. How had Watcher survived? Had he been pulling the strings from the shadows all along? When I arrived, I found Sarah in a state of panic, clutching a knife, her eyes wide with terror. I checked her apartment, ensuring every door and window was locked. "We need to go to the police," I said, but she shook her head. "They won't help. You know they have people everywhere. We have to handle this ourselves." "Handle it ourselves? How?" I demanded, frustration bubbling over. She handed me a laptop, her fingers trembling. "He sent me another link. It's another game. He wants us to play." I stared at the screen, a sense of dread settling in my stomach. The link was taunting us, daring us to enter the nightmare again. But what choice did we have? Ignoring it could mean certain death. "Fine," I said, steeling myself. "We play, but this time we do it on our terms." We set up the laptop, making sure to use a secure connection and anonymize our IP addresses as best we could. The game loaded, and the familiar dark, twisted graphics greeted us. This time, the stakes felt higher. The atmosphere more oppressive. Watcher's message flashed on the screen. "Welcome back. Let's see if you've learned anything." The game started, and we were thrown into a new map, an abandoned asylum. The tasks were even more gruesome, involving twisted medical experiments and brutal interrogations. My heart pounded as I navigated the halls, each corner promising new horrors. We played cautiously, completing the tasks and gathering clues. But it wasn't long before the first live feed appeared. It showed a man strapped to a gurney, his face contorted in pain. A masked figure loomed over him, brandishing a scalpel. "Stop it!" Sarah screamed at the screen, her voice breaking. "Leave him alone," Watcher's voice crackled through the speakers. "You have a choice. Save him or save yourselves. Find the code to unlock his restraints, or he dies." We frantically searched the map, looking for any clues to the code. Time was running out, and the man's screams grew more desperate. Finally, I found a note scribbled on the wall. 4 numbers that seemed out of place. "Got it!" I shouted, entering the code into the console. The restraints released, and the man slumped, gasping for breath. But our relief was short-lived. Watcher's laugh echoed through the room. "Well done. But can you save the next one?" The game continued, each round more harrowing than the last. We were forced to make impossible choices, each one weighing heavily on our conscience. The final round brought us to a room filled with monitors, each displaying a different feed of terrified captives. "This is the end game," Watcher's voice boomed. Choose one to save. The rest will die. I looked at Sarah, despair in her eyes. We can't choose, she said, her voice barely a whisper. We have to, I replied, my voice hollow. It's the only way to stop this. As we agonized over the decision, a message popped up on the screen. Time's up. The monitors went dark, and a video started playing. It was Sarah and me, filmed from outside her apartment. The timestamp was just minutes old. My blood turned to ice. They're here, I whispered. We need to leave. Now. We grabbed the laptop and ran out of the apartment, but as soon as we stepped into the hallway, masked figures blocked our path. They moved with eerie precision, herding us back into the apartment. Congratulations, Watcher's voice said from behind a mask. You've made it to the final level. Sarah screamed, and I felt a sharp pain as something struck the back of my head. The wart spun, and I hit the floor, my vision blurring. The last thing I saw before darkness claimed me was Watcher's mask looming over me. I woke up in a dark room, the only light coming from a screen in the corner. My hands were bound, and I could hear Sarah's muffled sobs beside me. The screen flickered to life and Watcher's face appeared. Welcome to the real game, he said. You've entertained us long enough. Now it's time for the final move. The screen showed a live feed of the room we were in. I saw us, bound and helpless, and a timer counting down from 10 minutes. Escape or die, Watcher said. Good luck. Panic surged through me as I struggled against the restraints. Sarah was doing the same, her eyes wide with terror. We had to find a way out. I scanned the room, looking for anything that could help. There, in the corner, was a small, sharp piece of metal. Sarah, I whispered, nodding towards the metal. Use that. She inched towards it, her movements slow and painful. She managed to grab it and started soaring through her restraints. The timer ticked down mercilessly. 5 minutes left. She freed herself and hurried to my side, working on my bindings. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, I was free. We ran to the door, but it was locked tight. Desperation clawed at us as we searched for another way out. 2 minutes left. Then I saw it. A ventilation shaft. There, I pointed, and we scrambled to open it. It was a tight fit, but it was our only hope. We crawled through the shaft, the timer echoing in our ears. We emerged into another room. Just as the timer hit 0, an explosion rocked the building, and we were thrown to the ground. I shielded Sarah with my body, debris raining down around us. When the dust settled, we were alive, but barely. We stumbled out of the building into the cold night air. Sirens wailed in the distance, drawing closer. We collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. The police arrived, and we were taken to the hospital. The evidence we had gathered was enough to bring down the remaining members of the network. Watcher was captured, unmasked, and his real identity shocked the world. He was someone I had seen on the news, a respected figure in the community. The revelation sent shockwaves through society. Sarah and I testified, our stories helping to ensure that those responsible would never hurt anyone again. But even with them behind bars, the scars remained. The nightmares persisted, and every shadow felt like a threat. We tried to rebuild our lives, finding solace in each other. The bond we formed through our shared horror was unbreakable. We moved to a new city, far away from the memories of our torment. But some nights, when the darkness feels too close, I still see Watcher's mask. I still hear the screams, and I wonder if the game is truly over, or if it's just waiting for the next player to join. Because in the end, the game never really ends. It just waits for the next move. Don't play Roblox if you find on the dark web. Hey everyone, I've been lurking on this subreddit for a while, but I finally decided to share my story. This happened about a month ago, and I'm still shaken to my core. I need to get it out there, maybe as a warning, or maybe just because I need to get it off my chest. So here goes. I'm a pretty avid gamer, always have been. I'm also a bit of a thrill seeker when it comes to the internet. The dark web always intrigued me, but I never really did much beyond just browsing. That was until I came across something that caught my eye. A Roblox game. Yeah, I know it sounds stupid. Why would a grown man be interested in a Roblox game on the dark web? But this wasn't just any game. It was called Hell's Playground, and the description said it was an extreme horror experience. I couldn't resist. After making sure my VPN was solid and using Tor, I downloaded the file. The game installed like any other Roblox game, but there was something off from the start. The icon wasn't the usual friendly, blocky logo. It was a distorted face, like a kid's drawing of a demon. I brushed it off and launched the game. The first thing that hit me was the graphics. Roblox is known for its blocky, simplistic design, but this was different. It was hyper-realistic, almost like it was trying too hard to look like a regular Roblox game, but failing. The colors were dark and muted, and the textures were disturbingly detailed. The main menu had a background of a playground, but it was empty, and the equipment was old and rusty. There was a soft, eerie music playing, like a music box slightly out of tune. I clicked play, and my character spawned in what looked like a normal Roblox town, but everything was just wrong. The NPCs had these unsettling, blank expressions. Their eyes followed me, but they never moved. I wandered around, trying to figure out what the game was about, but there were no instructions, no quests, nothing. Just this eerie town and its creepy inhabitants. After a while, I noticed a small child NPC standing alone in an alley. Something about her made my skin crawl, but I approached her. As I got closer, I noticed she had tears streaming down her face, and her mouth was moving, but no sound was coming out. A prompt appeared. Press E to interact. I did. The screen flashed, and suddenly, I was in a different place. It was a room, dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were covered in what looked like old stained wallpaper, and there was a smell. God, I can still remember that smell. It was like rotting meat and mold. My character was standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection wasn't my avatar. It was me, my actual face looking back at me with an expression of terror. The reflection started to move on its own, mouthing words I couldn't hear. Then without warning, it began to scream, the sound distorted and deafening. I yanked my headphones off, but the scream continued, coming from the speakers. I tried to exit the game, but nothing worked. Alt plus F4, Control plus Alt, delete, nothing. I was trapped. The reflection in the mirror stopped screaming and started to bleed from its eyes, the blood oozing down the screen. Then the screen went black. When it came back on, I was back in the town, but now it was night. The NPCs were gone, and the only light came from the street lamps, casting long, menacing shadows. I could hear something in the distance, like a faint whispering. I started to walk, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. As I turned a corner, I saw another player, or at least I thought it was. Their avatar was standing under a flickering street lamp, facing away from me. I approached them, hoping for some sort of interaction. As I got closer, I noticed their name tag was just a series of numbers. 001001. I typed in the chat, "Hello?" No response. I got closer and tried again. "Hey, can you hear me?" Suddenly, the avatar turned around. Its face was distorted, a twisted, nightmarish version of a Roblox character. Its eyes were too large, and its mouth was stretched into an unnatural, wide grin. Before I could react, it lunged at me, the screen glitching and flickering. My character fell to the ground, and the last thing I saw was that twisted face inches from mine. The screen went black again, and then I was back at my desktop. The game had closed itself. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped out of my chair. It was a text from an unknown number. "Did you enjoy the game?" I stared at the message, my hands shaking. I didn't respond. A few seconds later, another message came through. "Come back and play again soon." I deleted the game immediately, clearing every trace of it from my computer. But that wasn't the end. That night, I had a nightmare. I was back in that town, running through the dark streets, that twisted face always just behind me. I woke up drenched in sweat. The image burned into my mind. The next day, I received another text. "You can't escape." That's when the real terror began. My computer started acting strange. Files I didn't recognize would appear on my desktop. Disturbing images of mutilated faces and grotesque scenes. My phone would buzz at odd hours, always from that same unknown number, with messages like, "Join us," and "You belong here." I tried changing my number, getting a new computer, but it didn't help. Somehow, they always found me. The worst part is, I can feel them watching me. When I'm alone in my apartment, I can hear faint whispering, and sometimes I catch glimpses of that twisted face in the corners of my vision. I don't know what to do. I'm scared all the time, and I can't escape it. This isn't just a game. It's something much worse. Something evil that's latched onto me and won't let go. If you're reading this, please, for the love of God, stay away from the dark web. And if you ever come across a game called Hell's Playground, don't download it. It's not worth the nightmare. I didn't sleep much after that first night. Every creak, every shadow seemed to harbor that face. I started noticing changes in my apartment. Small things at first. Items misplaced. Lights flickering more than usual. But then, it got worse. One night, I woke up to find all the pictures on my walls turned upside down. Another night, the faucets in my bathroom and kitchen were running full blast, flooding the place. I was desperate for answers. I started digging into the game's origin, hoping to find some way to stop whatever was happening. Forums, dark web threads, obscure chat rooms. I scoured them all. I found scattered mentions of Hell's Playground, but nothing concrete. Just vague warnings and a few horror stories, eerily similar to mine. Most of them ended abruptly, the original posters disappearing from the forums. Then, I found a lead. A guy on a dark web forum claimed to have survived something similar. He went by the name Shadow Stalker. His posts were cryptic, filled with jargon and codes, but one thing was clear. He knew about the game. I messaged him, practically begging for help. It took a few days, but he finally responded. His first message was chillingly brief. "Meet me in the place where shadows dance." I didn't understand what he meant, and my confusion must have been evident. After a few more back and forths, he finally told me to meet him at an old abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the town. The place was notorious for being a hangout for junkies and squatters, but I was desperate. The warehouse was exactly as expected, dark, musty, and full of eerie echoes. I found Shadowstalker waiting in the back, hidden behind some old crates. He was a tall, thin man with a gaunt face, his eyes constantly darting around like he was expecting something, or someone, to jump out at any moment. "You're the one with the game problem," he stated, his voice a raspy whisper. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yes, I need to know how to stop it," he sighed, looking both frustrated and sympathetic. "You don't stop it. You survive it. That game, it's not just code, it's a gateway." "A gateway to what?" I asked, my voice trembling. "To them," he replied. "Entities that feed on fear, that thrive in darkness. They latch onto players, drawing them deeper into their world." He handed me a USB drive. "This has a program I wrote. It won't stop them, but it might buy you some time. It scrambles your digital footprint, makes it harder for them to track you. But you need to be careful. They don't like being denied." I took the drive, feeling a flicker of hope. "Thank you. Is there anything else I can do?" He hesitated, then leaned in closer. "There's one more thing. A ritual. It's dangerous, and there are no guarantees, but it might sever their connection to you." He gave me a piece of paper with strange symbols and instructions. "Do this at midnight, alone, and whatever you do, don't break the circle." I thanked him and left, clutching the USB drive and the paper like lifelines. That night, I ran the program. My computer whirred and clicked, and for the first time in days, the strange files and images stopped appearing. It was a small victory, but it was something. Midnight approached, and I prepared for the ritual. I followed the instructions meticulously, drawing the symbols and lighting the candles. The air grew heavy, and a chill settled over the room. I started the chant, my voice shaking. As I spoke the final words, the shadows around me seemed to thicken, coalescing into darker shapes. I kept my eyes on the circle, praying it would hold. Then I felt it, a presence, something ancient and malevolent pressing against the barrier I had created. The whispering began, a low, insidious murmur that grew louder with each passing second. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms becoming more defined. Faces, dozens of them, with those same twisted grins and hollow eyes, peered at me from the darkness. One of them stepped forward, its form solidifying. It was the face from the game, but now it was real, standing just outside the circle. It stared at me, and I could feel its hatred, its hunger. "You think you can escape?" it hissed, its voice a grotesque mockery of human speech. "We are everywhere. We are always watching." I kept chanting, my voice barely audible over the cacophony of whispers. The figure pressed closer, and I could feel the circle weakening. I poured all my concentration into the ritual, willing it to hold. Then with a final, desperate cry, I completed the chant. The shadows recoiled, and the figures began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart like smoke in the wind. The presence faded, and the room returned to its normal, albeit eerie state. I collapsed, exhausted but relieved. It worked. I had pushed them back, at least for now, but I knew it wasn't over. Shadowstalker's words echoed in my mind. They don't like being denied. The next day, I received another text from the unknown number. "You can't hide forever." The game was gone, but the fear remained. I knew they were still out there, waiting, and I knew it was only a matter of time before they tried again. If you ever find yourself tempted to explore the dark web, think of my story. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. In the days that followed, the haunting didn't stop. It merely changed form. It was as if the entities had become more insidious, more cunning. My dreams were no longer my own. Every night, I found myself back in that twisted Roblox town, wandering through darkened streets, always feeling like something was right behind me. The whispers followed me everywhere, even into my waking life. One evening, after another restless night, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The streets outside felt safer than my own apartment. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that seemed to move unnaturally. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I ended up at a nearby park, sitting on a bench and watching the last light of day fade away. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers and a couple walking their dog. For a moment, I felt a semblance of peace, but then my phone buzzed. I pulled it out, half expecting another text from the unknown number. Instead, it was an email. The subject line read, "We see you." My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. The body of the email was blank, but there was an attachment. Against my better judgment, I clicked on it. The attachment was a video file. It started with static, then slowly focused on a live feed. It was my apartment, viewed through my webcam. I watched in horror as the camera panned around my living room, finally settling on the ritual circle I had drawn days ago. The symbols were still faintly visible, but now there were new markings, disturbing symbols that I didn't recognize, smeared in what looked like blood. The camera zoomed in on these symbols, and the screen went black. Then, a distorted voice came through my speakers, whispering in a language I couldn't understand. The voice grew louder and more frantic, and suddenly, the video cut off. My phone buzzed again. "Did you enjoy the show?" I bolted back to my apartment, fear gripping my heart. When I got there, the door was ajar. I knew I had locked it when I left. Steeling myself, I stepped inside. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the apartment was deathly silent. The ritual circle was as I had seen it in the video, with those same sinister symbols smeared across it. I backed away, my mind racing. They were here. They had been in my home. My phone buzzed again. "You can't run." In a panic, I called Shadowstalker, but the number was disconnected. It felt like the walls were closing in on me. I needed help, but I didn't know who to turn to. Going to the police was out of the question. They'd think I was insane. I decided to stay at a motel that night, hoping to escape whatever malevolent force was pursuing me. The motel room was shabby and reeked of stale smoke, but it was a temporary refuge. I sat on the bed, trying to piece together what was happening. The dark web game, the ritual, the entities. None of it made sense, yet it was all too real. I knew they weren't just in my head. They were in my life, entwined with my very being. Around midnight, I heard a knock on the door. My heart leapt into my throat. Who would come here at this hour? I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. Another knock, louder this time. My pulse quickened as I opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty, but as I closed the door, a piece of paper slipped through the gap and landed at my feet. I picked it up, my hands trembling. It was another set of symbols, similar to the ones defacing my ritual circle, but more complex. There was a message scrawled at the bottom. Finish what you started. I spent the rest of the night in a state of paranoid vigilance, clutching the paper and trying to decipher the symbols. The whispering returned, this time louder and more aggressive. It felt like the walls of the motel room were vibrating with their voices. I was on the edge of a breakdown when the first light of dawn finally seeped through the curtains. I knew I couldn't keep running. I had to confront this head on. I went back to my apartment, fortified myself with coffee, and prepared to finish the ritual. I redrew the circle, copying the new symbols from the paper. The air grew colder as I worked, and I could feel the presence of the entities closing in. As I lit the candles and began chanting, the shadows around me deepened. The symbols on the floor started to glow, pulsating with an otherworldly light. The whispering turned into a cacophony of voices, all screaming at once. My head throbbed with the noise, but I forced myself to continue. Then the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in white puffs, and the candles flickered wildly. The air around me seemed to warp and twist, and suddenly, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was back in the dark Roblox town, standing in the middle of the street. The twisted NPCs were there, their faces grotesque and grinning. The player with the distorted face, 001-001, stood at the end of the street, beckoning me with a skeletal hand. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but I knew I had to finish what I had started. I walked towards the figure, my steps echoing loudly in the unnatural silence. As I got closer, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, like I was walking on the edge of a nightmare. The figure's face was a mask of pure malice, its eyes burning with a malevolent fire. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice echoing in my mind. "You belong to us now." I raised the paper with the symbols, reciting the final part of the chant. The ground trembled and the figure screamed, a sound of pure rage and pain. The world around me began to disintegrate, the twisted town collapsing into darkness. The next thing I knew, I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor. The symbols on the ground were gone, and the candles had burned out. The air was still and silent. I took a deep breath, feeling an overwhelming sense of relief. It was over. They were gone. Or so I thought. As I stood up, my phone buzzed with a new message. "We'll be back." I stared at the screen, dread washing over me. This nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. The realization that it wasn't over left me paralyzed with fear. I had fought so hard, but they were still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for their chance. Days turned into weeks, and the terror became a part of my daily life. I was always on edge, waiting for the next attack, the next message. The once comforting walls of my apartment now felt like a prison. Sleep became a distant memory. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that twisted game, chased by the grotesque faces that haunted my waking hours. I tried to stay awake as long as possible, but exhaustion always won in the end. The nightmares were relentless, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. One particularly dark night, I decided to take drastic measures. If the entities were going to keep coming for me, I needed to understand them better. I returned to the dark web, searching for any clues or information about Hell's Playground and the malevolent forces behind it. Most of what I found was useless. Scattered rumors, incoherent ramblings. But then, I stumbled upon a post by someone named Echo Hunter. Echo Hunter claimed to have delved deep into the origins of these dark web games. According to him, Hell's Playground was part of a series of cursed games created by a cult that worshipped ancient, malevolent entities. The games were designed to act as gateways, allowing these entities to enter our world by feeding on the fear of the players. His post was detailed and filled with references to old texts and occult practices. I messaged him immediately, explaining my situation and begging for any help he could offer. It took a few agonizing hours before he responded. These entities are parasites. They latch onto your fear and feed off it. The more scared you are, the stronger they become. You need to break their hold on you. How? I typed back, my hands shaking. There's a ritual, he replied. It's dangerous and requires immense willpower, but it might sever their connection to you permanently. He sent me the details, a complex ritual involving ancient symbols, blood offerings, and a specific incantation. It had to be performed at the darkest hour of the night, in complete isolation. The instructions were clear. Any interruption could be fatal. I prepared everything meticulously, gathering the required materials and memorizing the incantation. The night of the ritual, I barricaded myself in my apartment, ensuring there would be no interruptions. As midnight approached, I began. The symbols were drawn in a circle around me, and the candles were lit, casting an eerie glow. I made the necessary offerings, my hands shaking as I placed them in the center of the circle. The air grew heavy, and the temperature dropped, just like before. I started the incantation, my voice barely above a whisper. The room seemed to warp and twist around me, and the shadows grew darker, more defined. The whispering returned, louder and more aggressive than ever. I forced myself to keep chanting, pouring all my willpower into the ritual. The symbols on the floor began to glow, pulsating with an unnatural light. Then the ground trembled. The shadows coalesced into figures, their faces twisted in grotesque, mocking grins. They circled the edge of the ritual circle, unable to cross the barrier, but watching me with burning hatred. "Do you really think you can escape us?" one of them hissed, his voice a distorted echo. I ignored it, continuing the chant. The pressure around me intensified, like an invisible force trying to crush me. My vision blurred, and my head throbbed with the effort of maintaining the ritual. Suddenly, a loud crash came from outside the apartment. My concentration wavered, and the shadows surged forward, their forms distorting and twisting. I screamed the final words of the incantation, pouring every ounce of strength into it. The symbols on the floor flared brightly, and the shadows recoiled, screaming in rage. The air crackled with energy, and the figures began to disintegrate, their forms breaking apart like smoke in the wind. The temperature in the room returned to normal, and the pressure lifted. I collapsed, gasping for breath. The ritual had worked. The entities were gone, at least for now. But I knew they would never stop trying to find a way back. Exhausted and barely able to move, I crawled to my bed and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of hope. The next morning, I woke up to find my apartment undisturbed. The sense of dread that had been my constant companion was gone, replaced by a cautious optimism. I checked my phone, half expecting another message from the unknown number, but there was nothing. I spent the day cleaning up the remnants of the ritual, scrubbing away the symbols and disposing of the offerings. It felt cathartic, like I was reclaiming my space from the darkness that had invaded it. But as the day turned into evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't truly over. Just before midnight, my phone buzzed with a notification. My heart sank as I picked it up, dreading what I might see. The message was simple, yet chilling. See you soon. I stared at the screen, my hope fading. They were still out there, waiting, watching, and they wouldn't stop until they had me. That night, I resolved to find a way to end this once and for all. I couldn't live in fear forever. I needed to understand these entities, to find their weakness and destroy them. I spent the next few days researching tirelessly, diving deeper into the dark corners of the web and old occult texts. Every lead seemed to hint at a final confrontation, a way to confront the source of the entities and sever their connection to our world permanently. It was a dangerous path, but I had no other choice. The final piece of the puzzle came from an ancient manuscript I found referenced in an obscure forum. It spoke of a place called the Eternal Abyss, a realm where the entities originated. The manuscript detailed a ritual that could open a portal to this realm, allowing me to confront the source directly. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance I had. I gathered the necessary materials and prepared myself for the most dangerous journey of my life. The ritual had to be performed at the stroke of midnight, under the light of a full moon. As the fateful night approached, I felt a mix of fear and determination. This was my last chance to end the nightmare. I drew the symbols, lit the candles, and began the chant. The air grew heavy, and the room darkened, but I didn't waver. The portal opened before me, a swirling vortex of darkness. Taking a deep breath, I stepped through, into the heart of the abyss. The Eternal Abyss was a nightmarish landscape, filled with twisted, writhing shadows. The air was thick with the whispers of the entities, a cacophony of malevolent voices. At the center of it all was a figure, larger and more terrifying than any I had seen before. Its form was constantly shifting, a mass of darkness and eyes. "You dare to challenge us?" it boomed, its voice shaking the very ground. "I have no choice," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my insides. "I won't let you torment me anymore." The entity laughed, a sound that echoed through the abyss. "You cannot defeat us. We are eternal." I raised the manuscript, chanting the final words of the ritual. The symbols on the pages glowed, and a blinding light erupted from the book. The entity screamed, its form writhing and distorting. The light intensified, and the shadows began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart. The entity's screams grew louder, more desperate. The ground beneath me shook, and the abyss itself seemed to tremble. With a final deafening roar, the entity exploded into a cloud of darkness, which dissipated into nothingness. The whispers faded, and the air grew still. The abyss was empty, silent. I fell to my knees, exhausted but triumphant. I had done it. The connection was severed. The nightmare was over. The portal reopened, and I stepped back into my apartment, collapsing on the floor. The symbols and candles were gone, and the air felt lighter, cleaner. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I was free. But as I lay there, catching my breath, a single thought crossed my mind. What if they weren't the only ones? For a while, life returned to something resembling normal. The oppressive fear that had once gripped my every waking moment gradually dissipated. I returned to work, reconnected with friends, and even managed to sleep without nightmares. The memories of those dark days started to feel distant, like something from a bad dream, but the unease never completely left me. It lingered at the edges of my consciousness, a constant reminder of what I had faced. I stayed vigilant, wary of any sign that the entities might return. Weeks passed, then months, and I began to hope that it was truly over. Then one night, the unease became a full-blown panic. I was lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, when I heard it, the faint whispering. It was so soft at first that I thought I was imagining it, but as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, more insistent. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispering filled the room, echoing off the walls. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, a lingering fear manifesting in my mind. But deep down, I knew better. They were back. I jumped out of bed and turned on every light in the apartment, hoping the brightness would banish the shadows. The whispering persisted, an endless maddening drone. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. The message was simple. "We told you." A chill ran down my spine. They had found a way back. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think. There had to be something I missed, some way to finish this once and for all. I grabbed the manuscript, the one that had guided me to the eternal abyss, and frantically flipped through the pages. There, near the end, was a passage I had overlooked. It spoke of a final seal, a last resort to permanently close the gateway and banish the entities forever. The ritual was complex and dangerous, but I had no other choice. I gathered the necessary materials and prepared myself once again. Midnight came, and I stood in the center of my apartment, the symbols drawn around me. The air was thick with tension, the whispering growing louder, more frantic. I lit the candles and began the incantation, my voice trembling but determined. As I chanted, the room darkened, the shadows closing in. The whispering turned to screams, a chorus of tormented voices. The ground beneath me trembled, and the symbols glowed with an otherworldly light. I continued, pouring all my willpower into the ritual. Then the air seemed to tear open, a gaping maw of darkness forming before me. The figures emerged, their faces twisted in rage and desperation. They clawed at the barrier, trying to break through. At the center was the entity I had faced in the abyss, its form even more monstrous and terrifying. "You cannot defeat us," it roared, its voice shaking the walls. I held the manuscript high, shouting the final words of the ritual. The symbols flared brightly, and a blinding light erupted from the circle. The entities screamed, their forms distorting and breaking apart. The ground shook violently, and I felt like I was being torn apart. But I didn't stop. I kept chanting, kept fighting. The light grew brighter, the screams louder. The air crackled with energy, and I felt the presence of the entities weakening, their grip on this world slipping. With a final earth-shattering roar, the entity exploded into a cloud of darkness, which dissipated into nothingness. The light flared one last time, then vanished, leaving the room in complete silence. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. The whispering was gone. The shadows receded. The room felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted. I had done it. The final seal had been placed, and the gateway was closed. I lay there for a long time, letting the relief wash over me. The entities were gone, banished forever. I was finally free, but as I stood up, my phone buzzed once more. Dread filled me as I picked it up, fearing the worst. The message was from an unknown number, but it was different this time. "Thank you." I stared at the screen, confusion and fear battling for dominance. What did it mean? Who was thanking me? In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The oppressive fear was gone, but a new kind of unease had taken its place. I started noticing small, strange occurrences, flickering lights, objects moving on their own. It was as if something else had filled the void left by the entities. I spent hours poring over the manuscript, looking for answers. In the deepest recesses of the text, I found a passage that chilled me to the bone. It spoke of a balance, a necessary exchange. By banishing the entities, I had opened the door to something else, something even more ancient and unknowable. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. In my desperation to rid myself of the entities, I had unleashed something far worse. The final seal had not just closed the gateway, it had summoned a new darkness. I knew then that my fight was far from over. The true horror had only just begun, and this time there might be no escape. I watched a movie of my own life on the deep web. Hey Reddit, this is going to sound absolutely insane, but I swear on my life that every word I'm about to share is the truth. I've never been one to post on here, but after what I experienced, I need to get this out. Maybe someone out there can help me make sense of it all, or at least offer some kind of comfort. Here it goes. So I've always had a bit of a fascination with the dark corners of the internet. Not because I was into anything illegal, but the mystery of it all drew me in. The deep web, for those who don't know, is like an iceberg, where the surface web, what we use daily, is just the tip. There's so much more hidden beneath the surface, and a lot of it is pure darkness. One night, I was bored and decided to dive into the deep web out of curiosity. I'd done it a few times before, never finding anything more interesting than weird forums and creepy chat rooms. But this night was different. I found a link that led to a site called Life Archive. It looked like an old, poorly designed webpage from the 90s. Just plain text and links. No flashy graphics or anything. What caught my eye was a section called Personalized Movies. The description was vague, but promised a unique viewing experience tailored to the user. I don't know why, but I clicked on it. After a few moments, a message popped up, asking for my name and birth date. Again, don't ask me why, but I entered my details. I figured it was some kind of gimmick, maybe pulling from public records to create a story. A download link appeared, and before I knew it, a file named yourlife.move was saved on my desktop. I hesitated for a moment. I mean, who wouldn't? But curiosity got the best of me. I double-clicked the file, and the video player opened. The movie started with static, like an old VHS tape. Then the image cleared, and I saw myself. Not just some actor who looked like me, but literally me, standing in my bedroom, staring at my computer. My heart skipped a beat. How the hell did they do that? As the video progressed, I saw myself doing mundane things, brushing my teeth, making breakfast, going to work. Every single detail was accurate, down to the clothes I wore that day. It was like someone had been filming me without my knowledge. I started to feel sick to my stomach. Then things took a darker turn. The scenes became more intimate, more private. I watched myself in moments I thought were completely secluded. In the bathroom, in the shower, in bed. Whoever made this had access to every part of my life. I felt violated, like my privacy had been ripped away from me. But it got worse, much worse. The video started showing things that hadn't happened yet. I saw myself sitting at my desk at work, and then a man walked in. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face. He approached me from behind and pulled out a knife. I watched in horror as he stabbed me repeatedly. Blood splattered everywhere, and the expression on my face was one of pure terror. I paused the video, my hands shaking. This couldn't be real, right? It had to be some kind of sick joke. I checked the timestamp. It was for tomorrow. Panic set in. What if this was a threat? What if someone was planning to kill me? I didn't know what to do. Calling the police seemed pointless. What would I say? Hey, I found a movie on the deep web that shows my murder. They'd think I was crazy. So, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I called in sick to work the next day and stayed home, barricading myself in my apartment. I watched the video again, trying to find any clues about the man. His face was never shown, but there was something familiar about him. I couldn't place it, but I knew I had seen him before. That night, I barely slept. Every noise, every shadow outside my window put me on edge. The following day, I decided to do some digging. I went back to the Life Archive website, but it was gone. Just a 404 error. I checked my download history, but the file had disappeared from my computer. It was like it never existed. I started to question my sanity. Maybe I imagined the whole thing, but deep down, I knew it was real. I started to become paranoid, looking over my shoulder everywhere I went. I even moved to a new apartment, hoping to escape whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. For a while, things seemed to calm down, but then I received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Part 2 coming soon." Attached was a screenshot of the man in the hoodie standing outside my new apartment building. I don't know what to do. I feel like I'm living in a horror movie and there's no escape. If anyone has any advice or has experienced something similar, please help. I can't keep living like this. I stared at the email, my heart racing. The screenshot was grainy, but there was no mistaking the man in the hoodie standing outside my new apartment building. My first instinct was to delete the email and pretend it never happened, but I knew that wouldn't solve anything. Whoever this was, they had found me again. Moving hadn't worked. Running wasn't an option. I spent the next few hours pacing my apartment, trying to come up with a plan. I considered going to the police again, but without any solid evidence, it felt pointless. Instead, I decided to start my own investigation. I didn't have much to go on, but I knew I had to try something. First, I tried to trace the email. I don't know much about hacking or cybersecurity, but I used some basic tools I found online. As expected, the email was sent from an untraceable source. It was like whoever was behind this knew exactly how to cover their tracks. Next, I searched for any information about the Life Archive website. I scoured forums and chat rooms on the deep web, but there was no mention of it anywhere. It was like the site had vanished into thin air. The more I searched, the more hopeless I felt. Days turned into weeks, and the paranoia grew. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the faces around me, looking for anyone who might resemble the man in the hoodie. I installed extra locks on my doors, put up security cameras, and even started carrying a knife with me at all times. But nothing happened. No more emails, no more strange videos, just silence. Then one night, I heard a noise outside my apartment. It was a soft, scraping sound, like someone trying to pick a lock. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept towards the door, knife in hand. I peered through the peephole and saw a shadowy figure standing there. My blood ran cold. The figure moved quickly, and I heard the sound of paper sliding under the door. I waited, my breath held, until the shadow disappeared. When I was sure they were gone, I opened the door and picked up the paper. It was a handwritten note that read, "Watch this." Attached was a small USB drive. My hands trembled as I plugged the USB into my laptop. A single video file was on it, titled, "Your Life _ Part 2, Move." I hesitated, but I knew I had no choice. I had to watch it. The video began with the same static as before, then cut to a scene of my apartment. It was eerily quiet, the camera panning slowly through each room. Then it focused on my bedroom. There I was, lying in bed, fast asleep. The camera zoomed in on my face, and I could see the fear in my eyes, even in sleep. Suddenly, the camera panned to the window, and there he was, the man in the hoodie, staring in at me. He moved with unnatural speed, climbing through the window silently. He approached the bed, standing over me as I slept. I wanted to scream, to warn myself, but I was frozen in terror. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial of liquid. He uncapped it and held it under my nose. I watched in horror as my sleeping self inhaled deeply, then went completely still. He had drugged me. The next scene showed me being dragged out of bed and into the living room. The camera followed as the man tied me to a chair, making sure the bonds were tight. I could see my head lolling, still under the effects of the drug. He stood in front of me, his face still obscured, and whispered something in my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but I could see the terror on my face as I slowly regained consciousness. The man held up a piece of paper, and the camera zoomed in. It read, "You can't run. You can't hide. I'm always watching." I paused the video, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I felt sick, like I was going to throw up. This was more than just a threat. It was a promise. This person had been in my apartment, had drugged me, tied me up, and filmed the whole thing, and I had no memory of any of it. Desperation set in. I couldn't stay here anymore. I packed a bag with essentials, grabbed my laptop, and fled. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the overwhelming need to get as far away as possible. I checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, using cash to avoid leaving a trail. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I kept the knife under my pillow, clutching it tightly. I knew I had to figure out who this person was and why they were doing this to me, but I had no idea where to start. The next morning, I woke to find a note slipped under the motel room door. It was written in the same handwriting. "You can't escape. Part 3 is coming." I was trapped in a nightmare, and there was no way out. I was paralyzed with fear, staring at the note in my hands. "You can't escape. Part 3 is coming." It felt like a death sentence. Whoever was behind this knew exactly where I was, no matter where I ran. My mind raced, trying to piece together who could be doing this and why. I needed to think clearly. I took a deep breath, packed up my things, and left the motel, paying in cash, again to avoid leaving a trace. I drove aimlessly for hours, only stopping when I found another cheap motel in a different town. I checked in and immediately barricaded the door with furniture, double-checking the locks and windows. It was a temporary solution, but it gave me a slight sense of security. That night, I didn't dare to sleep. I sat in the corner of the room, knife in hand, staring at the door. Hours passed, and the silence was deafening. Every small noise made me jump. My thoughts kept spiraling. Why me? What did I do to deserve this? Morning came, and the sun's light didn't bring any comfort. I knew I couldn't keep running forever. I had to find out who was behind this. I decided to call my best friend Mark. We'd been close since college, and if there was anyone I could trust, it was him. "Mark, I need your help," I said, my voice shaking. I explained everything that had happened, from the deep web video to the notes and the man in the hoodie. There was a long silence on the other end before he finally spoke. "Jesus, man, that's insane. Are you sure you're not just having a breakdown or something?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "I wish I was, but it's real. I don't know what to do. I need somewhere safe to stay. Can I come over?" I pleaded. "Of course. Get here as fast as you can. We'll figure this out together," he reassured me. I drove to Mark's place, a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Seeing his familiar face was a huge relief. We sat down and I showed him the USB drive and the notes. He watched the videos, his face growing paler with each passing minute. "This is some seriously messed up shit, man," he muttered. "We need to go to the police." "I know, but what can I tell them? There's no evidence except for these videos and notes. They'll think I'm crazy or worse, that I made it all up," I said, feeling hopeless. "Well, we need to do something. We can't just sit here and wait for this psycho to find you again," Mark insisted. We spent the next few days trying to piece together any clues. Mark suggested looking into anyone who might have a grudge against me, but I couldn't think of anyone. My life was relatively normal. No enemies, no crazy exes. It just didn't make sense. One night, as we were brainstorming, Mark received an email. It was from an unknown sender, and the subject line read, "Watch Together." Attached was a video file named Your Life _Part 3. Move. "Dude, it's happening again," Mark said, his voice trembling. "They sent it to me this time." We hesitated, but we knew we had to watch it. The video began with the usual static, then cut to a scene inside Mark's house. The camera was shaky, like someone was holding it, walking through the rooms. It was like a bad found footage movie, except it was all too real. The camera panned to Mark's living room, where we were sitting, watching the video. My blood ran cold. The perspective shifted, and we could see ourselves on the screen, right in that moment. It was as if the video was being filmed in real time. "How is this possible?" Mark whispered, his face pale with fear. Then the camera turned towards the front door. We watched as it slowly creaked open, and the man in the hoodie stepped inside. He moved silently, his face still obscured, holding a large glinting knife. He made his way towards us, and the camera followed. I jumped up, grabbing the knife from the table. "Mark, we need to get out now." We bolted towards the back door, but it was locked from the outside. Panic set in as we heard footsteps approaching from the front. We ran upstairs, barricading ourselves in Mark's bedroom. I held the knife, ready to defend ourselves, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. We heard the creak of the stairs, each step closer and closer. Mark grabbed a baseball bat from under his bed, and we stood there, waiting, our hearts pounding in our chests. The door handle turned slowly, and the door creaked open. "Stay back!" I screamed, but there was no response, just the quiet, calculated movements of the man in the hoodie. He stepped into the room, the knife glinting in the dim light. His face was still hidden, but I could feel his eyes on us, cold and calculating. Mark swung the bat, but the man moved with inhuman speed, dodging it effortlessly. He grabbed Mark by the throat, lifting him off the ground. I lunged forward with the knife, but he swatted me away like I was nothing. I hit the wall hard, the breath knocked out of me. The man threw Mark to the floor, knocking him unconscious. He turned towards me, and I could see a sinister smile beneath the shadow of his hood. "You can't escape," he whispered, his voice chillingly calm. "Part 4 is coming." Before I could react, he was gone. I rushed to Mark's side, checking for a pulse. He was alive, but barely. I called 911, my hands trembling as I explained what happened. The police arrived quickly, and Mark was taken to the hospital. They questioned me for hours, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They thought it was a home invasion gone wrong, nothing more. I knew better. This was far from over. The hospital waiting room was suffocating. I sat there staring at the sterile white walls, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. Mark was in surgery, fighting for his life, and I was left alone, haunted by the image of the man in the hoodie. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally came out to speak with me. "He's stable," she said, "but it's going to be a long recovery. He's lucky to be alive." I thanked her, feeling a mix of relief and guilt. This nightmare had started with me, and now it had almost cost my best friend his life. I had to end this, but I had no idea how. The police had been no help, and I couldn't trust anyone else. I was on my own. I decided to return to my old apartment to gather some things. It was the last place I wanted to be, but I needed to collect my thoughts and figure out my next move. The apartment was just as I had left it, but it felt different now. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every noise a warning. I started packing a bag with essentials when I noticed a small unmarked envelope on the kitchen counter. My heart sank as I picked it up. Inside was another USB drive and a note that simply read, "Part 4. I sat down at my laptop, dread pooling in my stomach. I plugged in the USB and opened the video file. The familiar static filled the screen before cutting to a new scene. This time, it was a dimly lit basement. The camera panned around the room, showing tools, chains, and a blood-stained table. The sight made me nauseous. Then the camera focused on a figure tied to a chair in the center of the room. It was Mark. He was beaten, bruised, and barely conscious. The man in the hoodie stepped into view, his face still hidden, and began speaking in a low, menacing voice. "You can't protect them," he said, addressing the camera directly. "No matter where you run, no matter where you hide, I will find you. This is just the beginning." The man pulled out a large knife, identical to the one he had used in Mark's house. He ran it slowly across Mark's arm, drawing a thin line of blood. Mark groaned in pain, but he didn't have the strength to struggle. "Your friend was lucky this time," the man continued. "But luck runs out. Remember that." The video ended abruptly, leaving me staring at the blank screen. I was shaking, rage and fear mixing into a volatile cocktail of emotions. I couldn't let this monster win. I had to fight back, but I needed help. I remembered an old acquaintance from college, Sarah, who was a cybersecurity expert. We hadn't spoken in years, but I hoped she would remember me. I found her number and called, praying she would answer. "Hello?" she said, her voice cautious. "Sarah, it's me. Alex, I need your help. It's urgent," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Alex? Wow, It's been a long time. What's going on? She asked, her tone softening. I explained everything, from the deep web video to the attack on Mark. There was a long pause on the other end before she finally spoke. Okay, I'll help, but this is way out of the ordinary. We need to be careful. I met Sarah at her apartment, and she immediately set up a laptop, connecting to various networks and databases. First, let's try to trace these videos, she said, her fingers flying across the keyboard. If we can find the source, we might be able to figure out who's behind this. Hours passed as Sarah worked tirelessly. I paced the room, my mind racing with every worst-case scenario. Finally, she looked up, her face pale. Alex, this is bad. Whoever is doing this is using some seriously advanced techniques. But I found something. A username. Reaper 404. Reaper 404? I repeated, the name sending chills down my spine. Yeah, it's a handle linked to several dark web activities, all of them extremely disturbing. But there's more. This person has been active for years, stalking and tormenting people. You're not the first. The revelation hit me like a ton of bricks. So what do we do now? Sarah took a deep breath. We need to lure him out, make him think he has the upper hand. If we can get him to make a mistake, we might be able to trace him, but it's risky. Are you up for it? I nodded. I don't have a choice. Let's do it. Sarah and I spent the next few days setting up a trap. We created a fake deep web account, posing as someone looking to hire Reaper 404. We offered a large sum of money for his services, hoping to pique his interest. It was a dangerous game, but it was the only chance we had. One night, we received a response. It was a simple message. Meet me, midnight. Location attached. The location was an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the town. Classic horror movie setting, but we had no choice. Sarah and I prepared as best we could. She brought her laptop and some hacking tools, while I carried a small handgun I had bought for protection. We arrived at the warehouse, the air thick with tension. Every sound echoed ominously in the empty space. We set up in a corner, hidden from view, and waited. Midnight came and went, and still no sign of Reaper 404. I was beginning to think it was a setup when we heard footsteps approaching. The man in the hoodie appeared, his face still obscured, moving with the same eerie calm. Sarah started typing furiously on her laptop, trying to trace his signal. Keep him talking, she whispered to me. Why are you doing this? I shouted, stepping into view. What do you want from me? The man stopped and tilted his head, as if amused. You think you can stop me? You're just a pawn in a game you can't even comprehend. He took a step closer, and I raised the gun, my hand shaking. Stay back, I warned. He laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the warehouse. You won't shoot. You don't have it in you. I pulled the trigger, the sound deafening. In the empty space, the man staggered, clutching his shoulder. Blood seeped through his hoodie, but he didn't fall. Instead, he laughed again, a guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. Sarah, now, I yelled. She hit a final key, and the man's laughter stopped abruptly. He looked down at his phone, realization dawning on him. What did you do? He growled. We traced you, Sarah said, standing up. It's over. The man lunged at her, but I fired again, hitting him in the leg. He fell to the ground, writhing in pain. Sarah called the police, and we waited, the tension finally breaking as sirens filled the air. The police arrived and took the man into custody. His face was finally revealed. Just an ordinary man, someone you wouldn't look twice at on the street. But the evil in his eyes was unmistakable. As they took him away, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. The nightmare was over, but the scars would remain. I turned to Sarah, grateful beyond words. "Thank you," I said, my voice shaky. "I couldn't have done this without you." "We're not done yet," she replied. "We need to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." The investigation that followed uncovered a horrifying truth. Reaper 404 had been stalking and tormenting people for years, leaving a trail of trauma and despair. But now, thanks to Sarah, his reign of terror was finally over. I knew I had a long road to recovery ahead, but I also knew I wasn't alone. With Sarah and Mark by my side, I felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in months. The deep web had shown me the darkest parts of humanity, but it had also shown me the strength of friendship and the power of resilience. As I left the warehouse, I took one last look at the place where my nightmare had almost ended. I knew I would never forget the horrors I had faced, but I also knew I would never let fear control my life again. Reaper 404 was behind bars, but I would always be looking over my shoulder, ready to face whatever darkness came next. After Reaper 404 was taken into custody, life started to return to some semblance of normalcy. Mark was recovering well, though he would need therapy and support for the trauma he'd endured. Sarah and I became closer friends through the ordeal, and we promised each other we'd stay vigilant, always watching out for any signs that someone else might try to follow in Reaper 404's footsteps. But the peace was short-lived. One night, a few weeks after the arrest, I received a call from the police. They had gone to check on Reaper 404 in his cell, but he was gone, vanished without a trace. My heart dropped. How was that even possible? I didn't sleep that night. The familiar dread crept back into my mind, gnawing at me. I tried to keep busy, focusing on work and helping Mark with his recovery, but the anxiety never fully left me. I was constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that man in the hoodie lurking in the shadows. A month later, I received another package at my door. This time, it was a small, unmarked box. My hands shook as I opened it, revealing a single item, a DVD. It was labeled The Final Chapter. I didn't want to watch it, but I knew I had no choice. Ignoring it wouldn't make the problem go away. I called Sarah, and she rushed over to my apartment. We set up the laptop and inserted the DVD, bracing ourselves for whatever horrors awaited us. The video started with the usual static, then cut to a scene that sent chills down my spine. It was Mark's hospital room. The camera panned around, showing him asleep in his bed, hooked up to various machines. The scene was eerily quiet, the only sound the beeping of the heart monitor. Then the door to his room creaked open, and the man in the hoodie stepped in, moving silently. "No," I whispered, horror washing over me. How did he get there? Sarah tried to hack into the video, looking for clues, but it was encrypted. We had no way of tracing it. We could only watch as the man approached Mark's bed, pulling out a syringe filled with a clear liquid. He injected it into Mark's IV line, and I could see Mark's heart rate slowing on the monitor. "We need to call the hospital," Sarah said, grabbing her phone. But before she could dial, the video cut to a new scene. This time, it was my apartment. The camera was outside, looking in through the living room window. I could see myself and Sarah sitting on the couch, watching the video in real time. "He's here," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He's watching us right now." We bolted for the door, but it was too late. The power went out, plunging the apartment into darkness. Panic set in as we fumbled for our phones, trying to find a light. A cold, familiar voice echoed through the room. "Did you really think you could escape me?" The man in the hoodie stepped out of the shadows, his knife glinting in the faint light from our phones. He moved with terrifying speed, knocking Sarah to the ground. I tried to fight back, but he was too strong. He grabbed me by the throat, squeezing until I couldn't breathe. "This is the final chapter," he whispered, his breath hot against my ear. "Your story ends here." I struggled, desperate to break free, but my vision started to blur. Just as I thought it was over, I heard a loud crash. The door flew open, and Mark, battered but alive, charged in with a baseball bat. "Get away from him!" Mark yelled, swinging the bat with all his strength. He hit the man square in the head, knocking him to the floor. I gasped for air, falling to my knees. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her face pale but determined. Together we tied the man up, using whatever we could find. We called the police, and they arrived within minutes, taking the man away once again. This time, there was no escape for Reaper 404. The police ensured he was placed in a maximum security facility with constant surveillance, but the damage was done. The scars he left on our lives would never fully heal. In the weeks that followed, we tried to move on. Mark, Sarah, and I leaned on each other for support, finding strength in our friendship. The nightmares persisted, but we refused to let fear control us. We had faced the darkness and survived, and we vowed never to let it consume us again. One day, as we were having lunch together, Sarah received an email from an unknown sender. Her face went pale as she read it. Then she handed her phone to me. The subject line read, "To be continued." I felt a cold chill run down my spine, but then I looked at Mark and Sarah. We had faced the worst and come out stronger. No matter what came next, we would face it together. The battle wasn't over, but we were ready.